Hi everyone. So this week on Freedom Fanatics, we'll be discussing the importance of free speech. We'll be looking at 3 times mass violence shocked South Africa, and then check out our quote of the week by Martin Luther King Jr. So stay tuned. This is going to be a great show. So, welcome to Freedom Fanatics, a production of the Freedom Advocacy Network. This show is every Tuesday at 6 p.m. on YouTube and Facebook, and you can also find it on IGTV. Each week, we discuss the latest fan content with authors and creators right here. My name is Sholan, and my guests this week are Michael Morris, who is an editor at the Daily Friend and the head of media at the South African Institute of Race Relations. And then we also have Marius, who's also an editor at the Daily Friend, and Marius is a writer at the South African Institute of Race Relations. And thank you guys for being on the show today and for making the time. Right now, we'll have a look at our latest explainer video, which is released every Monday. And this week's explainer video is titled Freedom of Speech, Use It or Lose It. Let's have a quick watch.
The concept of free speech rests on the simple idea that whatever people think, they should be able to say. In a free society, differences of opinion are inevitable and tolerated, and these differences of opinion are better resolved by argument than force or violence or threat. Freedom of speech isn't always comfortable, because it often means defending the rights and freedom of people who say unpleasant things or things we don't agree with. History shows that people with the power to dominate or dictate how people think use this power to crush the freedom to believe in a different way of life. Even though freedom is uncomfortable, uncomfortable freedom is so much better than no freedom at all. Without the freedom to exchange ideas, views, and beliefs, we cannot find solutions to our problems. One of the most important defenses of free speech in history was crafted in a dissenting judgment in the 1929 US Supreme Court case of Hungarian pacifist Rosika Schwimmer, who was denied citizenship for refusing to swear that she would take up arms to defend her adopted home country of America. In a dissenting opinion, aging Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who fought and was wounded in the American Civil War, declared that there is no principle that more imperatively calls for attachment than the principle of free thought. Not free thought for those who agree with us, but freedom for the thought we hate. The freedom of speech codified in our Constitution is key to building a better South Africa based on better ideas. If you want to live in a free country where you can think, write, sing, pray, and speak freely, you must stand up for freedom of speech, even when it becomes difficult or uncomfortable.
Yeah, so Michael, I'll come to you first. You have been a writer for more than 20 years, if I'm not mistaken. And most of your career has been based on the ability for you to speak and write like your ideas, your views, and your beliefs freely. So how important do you consider freedom of speech to be in society? And does freedom of speech have the ability to change the lives of ordinary people?
Thanks, Sheldon. First of all, I'm flattered that you think I've been writing only for 20 years. It's in fact 38 years, or now 40, I think, actually.
Wow.
But your point remains valid. I'm often fond of citing the words of a particularly courageous opponent of Indira Gandhi in 1970s India, at a time when her administration was intent on imposing emergency regulations to curb civil liberties in the name of the national interest. And this is something we often hear from governments and statist polities. And the man, Kushrai Rani, in this particular instance, warned Indira Gandhi with these words, that there are no freedoms so dangerous as those that are not exercised. And it's a very powerful idea. And I think this applies preeminently to free speech. And to get to your essential point is how important is freedom of speech, and does it have the ability to improve lives? It's not simply an abstract idea. It is actually the founding principle, the foundation really of any open democratic society. And it's simply this, that there is no idea under the sun that cannot be subjected to scrutiny and reason. That's the kind of foundational idea of free speech. And that societies that trust in scrutiny and reason are better off for being unafraid, open, and free. So it does really relate to everyday things. It's a society that is capable of listening to itself, of addressing real problems that are spoken about, allowing people to say what those real problems are, and leaving the field as wide as possible to actually address those real issues without people being anxious about saying the wrong thing. So it really is a fundamental part of a reasonable, optimistic, open, and free society.
Yeah. And somebody that I know who is quite opinionated and who likes to scrutinize things, as Michael said, is Marius. And Marius, on social media specifically, things appear to become, how do I say this, more polarizing, and we see things like censorship, which is essentially the regulation of speech, something Michael has warned us about. And it becomes more prominent on major social media platforms. Do you consider this to be a threat to the future of free speech?
Yeah, I think that's one of the problems the world's going to be grappling with over the next few decades, is the issue of free speech and speaking on big social media platforms. Platforms like Facebook and Twitter, they're obviously private platforms, so they can decide who can have a voice on their platforms and so on. But they've become now so big, especially Facebook. Facebook is basically the equivalent of the public square. And obviously, in history, the public square in a free society, the public square was where anybody could come and say anything. I mean, I think a good analogy is to say, in the public square, somebody can come say, Marius is an idiot, but he can't come say that in my house, because my house is not a free speech zone, but the public square is a free speech zone. So, and that's the issue with things like Facebook and Twitter. They're private companies, but they're also so big. Should we sort of view them as a public good rather than private companies? And I think that's something that's going to be a big issue that we're going to be grappling with going into the future. I mean, we've seen already Donald Trump, who was banned off Twitter and so on. And I mean, I've said this before, I'm not a fan of Donald Trump, but I'm not sure he should be banned off Twitter. I think same with Julius Malema, was also banned off Twitter now. And was Julius Malema inciting violence on Twitter? If he was, then obviously even the free speech in general normally doesn't go to inciting violence, inciting hatred. So these are the things that we can be grappling with going into the future, I think. And especially, I mean, but whenever new technology comes in, it disrupts things. I mean, the internet is just an example. Things like the printing press, whenever there's a new innovation that changes the world, and humans have to grapple with it. And I think the internet is no different. But as I said, it's going to be a big issue that we having to, work out how to work with the internet and free speech going over the next couple of decades.
Yeah, and that's looking a bit to the future. And Michael, I don't want to give away your age here, but I know that you were an anti-apartheid journalist as well, if I'm corrected. And even during that period, I'm sure you had views that were against the things that apartheid policies were trying to implement. Did you face any restrictions on the things you could say during that time?
Yes, there certainly were. I mean, I think there are two things to be said. The one is there was a panoply of laws that was, that's perhaps the wrong metaphor, but an armory of laws really that was built, constructed by the National Party government to stop society being free in the first place, but also expressing itself and talking about its problems. The most obvious one was the banning, obviously, of the ANC. And as soon as you ban people who weren't even members of the ANC, and as soon as you ban somebody, you weren't able to quote them. So it was a real shutting down of alternative voices and the voices of majority of people. On the other hand, in fact, a great deal was known. And I would often think back during the 90s when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was on, and you'd hear people saying, we just didn't know. And I think mostly that was a lie. There was a great deal was, in fact, possible to report. We did report it. You found ways around it. And society was actually better informed about how bad apartheid was than those denialists might suggest. Just a very interesting instance, if I could just elaborate briefly. When I was based at the old Argus Group's London office, we discovered that while in South Africa, if a fellow reporter had gone out to cover what would have been called an unrest event, the procedure in the mid-80s was that they would then have to check the details, have to actually vet the details through the state's media office before publishing. And obviously that was a process to slow down the dissemination of information about what was actually happening. We discovered that from the London office, if we saw something on television, we could actually report back to South Africa, and legitimately, our papers could legitimately publish a report saying, last night British television viewers saw, and then we could simply describe what had happened. So we could circumvent the law in that way. So there was a great deal of ingenuity and imagination used to try to keep society informed. But having said that, you're quite right. There was an extensive apparatus of obscuring the news, obscuring what was happening.
Yeah, thank you guys for highlighting the importance of freedom of speech, not only for our past, but what is still to come, and what it holds for our future as well. And so to our viewers, don't forget to watch our explainer videos, which are released every Monday, and they can be found on all our social media platforms. You can check out our Facebook page, Freedom Advocacy Network. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at Badger of Liberty. And next up, we will be looking at our article of the week, which was actually written by Marius Rood. And in it, he identifies 3 times mass violence shocked South Africa. So, Marius, the past week, we saw violent protests and mass looting in South Africa. And this has shocked many, especially the younger generation, who has not seen this type of violence before. Is this a new thing, or has this always been a feature of South Africa's history?
Yeah, it's definitely been a feature of South Africa's history. I mean, going in our post-1910 history, when South Africa became a union, there are lots of examples of violence against the state and by the state. And before 1910, the South African history is replete with examples of violence. I mean, whether it was official wars between people resisting colonialism, or between Afrikaners and the British Empire, and whatever the case was, or even between amongst the Black South Africans, or what would become Black South Africans later themselves. And Mfakana is a good example, I think, of where Black South Africans, there was violence between them. And they obviously had the various Boer wars. We had various wars on the Eastern Cape, or what would become the Eastern Cape border, the frontier wars and so on, the War of the Axe and all that kind of thing. But if we look at more recent history, after in the 20th century, South Africa's had a lot of examples of where there's been violence. I think a big example, and one that I'm quite fascinated about, is something that was called the Rand Revolt. And that was a rebellion by white miners in what is today Gauteng. They were upset about dropping their wages. And because what happened was that the gold price was dropping in South Africa in the early 1920s. This led to mining companies dropping wages and also trying to appoint Black South Africans to skilled work. There was still a color bar in South Africa, but this also meant that if you could appoint Black people to do certain jobs, you could pay them less than white people. But now the white workers weren't happy about this. There was this led to a strike, and then actually a full-on uprising against the government, which lasted for about 4 months. There was actually 2 months of quite hardcore fighting between the government and these workers, and led to the deaths of 200 people. The workers even actually took over a couple of towns in Gauteng, places like Benoni and Brakpan, Fordsburg in Johannesburg. So it was actually quite something, and it changed South African history. Jan Smuts was the Prime Minister of South Africa at the time, and because of his actions at the Rand Revolt, he probably lost the 1924 election to a coalition of the National Party and the Labour Party, and that probably had quite significant implications for South African history, and it probably led to eventually to the win of the National Party in 1948 and the beginning of apartheid. And then another issue another event that I raised in my article was 1949 Durban riots between Indian and Black South Africans. And this was when Black South Africans in Durban, so it was mainly Zulus, attacked Indian shopkeepers and people and Indians going about their business in Durban. Still not too clear what actually sparked it. There's some rumors that there were some nefarious elements that were encouraging Zulus to attack Indians. There are rumors that there were white South Africans who were also stoking the flames of this, but it was not a very good situation for anybody. I think about 40 people died. I see about 140 people died. 1,000 people were injured, and actually resulted in some refugees, Indians leaving Durban and going to go find safety and so on. So there was also that's something. I mean, I only found about that fairly recently. So it's something I think we need to know for our history. But also, I mean, if you look at that, it was obviously a terrible thing that happened. But Indians and Black South Africans came together off that to work together to fight against apartheid. So I think that is something that we have to look at. They came together in a common cause. And in my opinion, I know there'll be some people who will disagree with me. I think generally South Africans of all races get on pretty well today. And even though we saw there was some people protecting their property down in Durban during these riots, didn't seem to me to be a race issue. People were protecting their area. They weren't saying you can't come in here because you're Indian or black or white or whatever the case is. You just had to be a resident of the area, and then you could come in. Look, there might have been a racial element, but I didn't see that, and I think that's something we have to acknowledge. And then finally, there was the third thing I put in my article was the 1976 Soweto uprising. I'm sure most of our listeners will have heard about this, or at least know a bit about this. This was when school children marched through Soweto to protest against the fact that they were going to have to learn in Afrikaans. That was going to be the medium of instruction in their schools. And obviously, these were kids whose first language wasn't Afrikaans, or Afrikaans was the language they wanted to be taught in. And on 16th of June, a group of children, estimates put out between 3,000 and 10,000 kids, went on a march in Soweto. They were met by armed police who opened fire on the kids. There'll be a famous photo that I'm sure most people will be familiar with, of Hector Peterson bleeding from his mouth and being carried by Mbuyisa Makubo, who actually nobody knows what happened to him. He went into exile. Nobody knows what happened to Makubo. But that was obviously a famous photo, and it became, the symbol of the terror of apartheid and, the brutality of the apartheid state in South Africa. But that also led to there was lots of violence in Soweto that night. It only lasted nights. Heavily armed police came and put it down the next day. But these protests spread around the country. There are protests all over the country. There were also white people got involved. White students from Wits marched against kids having to be taught in Afrikaans. And this is also, I think it's similar. There's an analogy you can draw to the Rand Revolt. Lots of historians, and I think I agree, say this was kind of the beginning of the end for apartheid. That's when the contradictions of the system really started to build up, and it became clear this wasn't a sustainable system, and that the white government was going to have to make a plan to bring black South Africans and coloured and Indian South Africans into the governing system somehow, because there was no way to carry on as it was. And as you saw, 14 years later, Nelson Mandela was released and the ANC was unbanned, and 4 years after that we had our first democratic elections.
Sure. Michael, I'd also like to bring you in on this point real quick. Something that Marius highlights at the end of his article is that we see that in South Africa, after major episodes of violence, you eventually see this political change, like significant political change in the country. What political change do you think could be waiting for South Africa after these recent incidents?
It's possibly a weak spot of mine, given my attachment to being doubtful about predicting the future. But I think his piece brings out a number of things, and his comments right now. If we look back at how South African society has evolved over the 1800s, I mean, virtually every year I think was a bloody year, and going into the 20th century, obviously we saw a much more focused incidents emerging as the society formed in its broken sort of way. But the interesting thing, and perhaps it relates to your question, is that I've often felt that we're not really a revolutionary society. We are certainly capable of and willing to turn to violence when something important happens and we feel strongly enough to to kind of exert our sentiment, and that's that's highlighted in Morris's piece. They're these sort of peaks that become unignorable because they're reflecting kind of popular sentiment, and I think certainly what we've seen in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng, especially over the past week, is something quite distinctive, and it's an indication of where society is at. There are a lot of desperate people. Even if they were instigators at work, you would have to, they're operating in an environment where instigation is very likely, is very possible, precisely because of the conditions people are living in. So what one hopes, which is slightly different from what is going to happen, but what one hopes is that attention will be paid to this, as indeed eventually happened after 76 and so on. And 1960, of course, was the Sharpeville incident, the Sharpeville massacre. So these moments of bloodshed or ructions can in fact be very pregnant with political possibility, because they really do reflect a very strong sentiment in a society that is, as I think, not especially revolutionary in spirit.
Okay, yeah. Thank you guys for that discussion. And remember, you can find all our written content on our website, freedomadvocacy.net, where Marius and Michael are they contribute a lot to fans' content, especially our written content, and we're grateful for that. And finally, we'll be looking at our quote of the week, which is by Martin Luther King Jr., who was a Baptist minister, and he was also a civil rights activist in the United States of America. And Dr. King states that in spite of temporary victories, violence never brings permanent peace. It solves no social problem. It merely creates new and more complicated ones. And after the past week, we have seen the consequences of destructive protesting and looting in South Africa. We have seen the greater loss of jobs and destruction of infrastructure, which actually sustains the economic activities of provinces such as KZN and Gauteng as well. And we know clearly now that violence only worsens social problems that already exist in South Africa. And Marius, do you have any final thoughts for us?
Yeah, I think sometimes violence is, I don't want to say necessary, but I think sometimes people are pushed to it. I think a good example is apartheid South Africa. Black South Africans were asking for, a seat at the table to, be part of governing the country, and they refused. And at the end of the day, I mean, something like Umkhonto Isizwe was inevitable. But I think in a country like South Africa, as it is today, where we're democratic, people can go make their voice heard at the ballot box. There's freedom of speech. Violence is not the answer. People need to go make their voices heard, as I said, at the ballot box. Go protest peacefully. And like I said, violence only exacerbates social problems. And we've seen now the violence of the last week. All that's going to happen now is it's going to lead to loss of jobs, loss of income for thousands of South Africans, and which is not good for anybody. It's not good for the broader economy, and certainly not good for the individuals who are going to lose their jobs. And yeah, it's not great.
Yeah, thanks for that. And now we've reached the end of this episode. So guys, don't forget to catch us every Tuesday at 6 p.m. on YouTube, and you can find this video on IGTV as well. And to join FAN, you can sign up at freedomadvocacy.net. And remember guys, your freedom is worth fighting for.